You might be wasting huge amounts of time in Mythic Plus without even realizing it. Even more surprising, your keys could actually go faster if you did less damage. It does sound a bit strange, but today we're going to dive into a concept that is hugely important but also very misunderstood: priority damage. A lot of players think that prio damage just means nuking the most dangerous mob in a pack as fast as possible, and while this is kind of true, the real power of priority damage actually comes from time saving. Once we see how this works, it'll actually completely change the way that you approach Mythic Plus pulls. So let's break it down. What actually is priority damage? In simple terms, a class has good prio damage if it outputs more damage onto its main target compared to the targets surrounding it. So to help visualize this, we're going to split the damage profiles into 3 clear categories. So first up, we're going to use the patter. This type of class does equal damage to everything in the pack, no matter what their priority target is. Our example is going to be a Rep Paladin spamming Divine Storm for equal damage across the entire pack. Next, we have the Prio DPS. So most DPS do fall into this category to some degree. These classes deal slightly more damage to the main target and a little bit less to everything else. So for this, we're going to use a Devastation Evoker, engulfing its primary target and cleaving onto the rest. And finally, we've got the Funneler. These classes take it a step further, doing even more damage to their priority target because there's other mobs around it. So our perfect example is an Arcane Mage, blasting the main target for huge damage if other mobs are present around it. Now, let's look at some scenarios to show how these damage profiles actually affect your speed through a Mythic Plus run. These are simplified examples, of course, but they'll make the impact of each damage profile really clear for us to understand. Okay, so let's run our first example. In this situation, we are going to have 6 loader bots, all of them with an equal 10,000 HP. So first up, we're going to use the patter. Our Rep Paladin is spamming Divine Storm and doing 120 DPS evenly to all mobs in the pack. This means that all of them die at the same time, and it takes 83.3 seconds for the Paladin to clean up the entire group. Pretty clean and simple. Next, we are going to look at our Prio DPS. This is our Devastation Evoker. It's going to focus one target at a time for 130 DPS. And the cleave is going to hit for 100 DPS. So here's how this plays out. To start with, we do 130 DPS to a single mob. It dies in 76.9 seconds, but leaves the rest sitting at 2,310 HP. We then swap focus. The next focus mob dies in 17.8 seconds and leaves the remaining 4 with 530 HP. And our last mobs die in approximately 5 seconds. So all up, we're going to have a total kill time of 99.7 seconds. Not bad, but a bit slower than our patter. And then next, our Funneler. So our Funneler is going to do a whopping 180 DPS to the main target, but is only doing 70 DPS to the remaining targets. So in this situation, our first mob dies in 55.5 seconds, and leaves the remaining mobs with 6,115 HP. The second priority mob will then die in 34 seconds, leaving the rest of the mobs with 3735 HP. The third priority mob will die in another 20.75 seconds and leave the remaining mobs with about 2,200 HP. And if we say about 20 seconds to clean up the remaining mobs, this will give us a total of 132.25 seconds to kill the entire pack. Now, the takeaway here is that in a totally even AoE situation, the patter wins by a mile. However, this actually starts to change a lot as we start to introduce different priority mobs and other dangerous mobs to the pack. Let's be real, dungeons don't generally look like 6 mobs with the same amount of HP lined up nice and evenly for us to kill. More often than not, we've got one big chunky lieutenant mob in the middle surrounded by all of the smaller mobs. So for example 2, we're going to make it a little bit more realistic. We've swapped out one of the loader bots and replaced it with a shredder tank. So this is going to sit at 30,000 HP while the loader bots have the 10,000 HP from before. So let's see how the different damage profiles handle this. We're going to start out with our patter again. the Divine Storming Ret Paladin is going to kill all of the small mobs in 83.3 seconds again, so same as before. But here's where the problem arises. Since priority damage is non-existent, the Shredder is still left with 20,000 HP. So at 120 DPS, that takes an extra 166 seconds to clean up. So all up, we have 249.9 seconds in total to kill the pack. So quite a lot slower. Next, we have our Prio DPS. So the Dev Evoker clears up all of the small mobs in 100 seconds, but leaves the Shredder with 17,000 HP thanks to the additional priority damage that it's doing. So then if we say at 130 DPS on just the Shredder, this takes an additional 130.8 seconds to kill and brings our total time to 230.8. So a bit better than the Patter this time, now that we've introduced a larger mob in the middle. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. We are going to look at our funneler. So because we've got multiple mobs and it relies on those mobs to do extra priority damage, we're going to have a huge amount of damage up front. So the Arcane Mage is going to be doing 70 DPS to the small mobs. It's going to clear them all up in 142 seconds, but then it's just going to leave the Prio mob with 4,285 HP. Now, we're going to drop down the DPS a little bit just to make it more realistic because there's no more funnel left, but with only 4,200 HP remaining, we're going to say at 130 DPS, it will take 42.85 seconds to polish off this mob. So total time is now 185.75 for our funnel class, which shows us, I guess, that if there is a big mob, a big lieutenant mob in the middle, all of a sudden the funneler pulls in front by a long margin and our pad DPS starts to fall way behind. But here's the thing, DPS don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in a group with other DPS around them. So the question becomes not so much which damage profile is best, but how many DPS in a given situation are utilizing a certain damage profile. So for scenario 3, we're going to include 2 DPS at the same time. We're going to include our Patter and our funneler. But to give it a bit more nuance, we're going to give the Ret Paladin a choice. It can either use mass AoE and do 120 DPS to every mob, or it can take a more priority-focused approach, say using Final Verdict, and do 140 DPS to its main target and 90 DPS as cleave. So in scenario A, we're going to make our Ret Paladin choose Divine Storm. Now, in this situation, we have the loader bots going down in 52.9 seconds with a combined DPS of 190 to all of them. The Shredder goes down a fair chunk, but it is left with 14,210 HP. Now, from this point onwards, we have 240 DPS on the remaining Shredder alone, as the mage has lost its funnel, so its individual DPS is going down. And this now takes another 64.6 seconds to kill, leaving us with a total time of 117.2 seconds. For damage breakdowns, we have the Paladin doing 45,600 total damage, hits a peak DPS of 720, and an average DPS of about 390. On the other hand, we have the Mage doing about 34,300 damage, peaking at 530 and ending with a DPS of 293. Situation B, we're going to have our pad DPS, the Paladin, be a little bit more ethical and do a Prio heavy focused rotation. In this situation, the loader bots do take a little bit longer to kill at 62.5 seconds. However, we are left with a Shredder that only has 10,000 HP. Now, same as before, we have 240 DPS on the remaining HP of the Shredder. This takes an additional 41.7 seconds and leaves us with a total time of 104.2, which is quite a bit quicker. For damage breakdowns, we now have the Paladin contributing slightly less damage at 42,700 with a peak DPS of 590, but And overall, that's actually a bit higher, even though it's done less damage. Now, the mage contributes more this time, 37,200. Same peak at 530, and a higher overall of 357, my mistake. Now, the higher overalls is because the pull time is shorter, but like, what is our takeaway here? Even though the AoE focused build from the Paladin looked flashier with a higher upfront DPS, so the meters spike really high, taking a more priority focused build where the Paladin does less damage overall actually makes the pull go significantly faster. And maybe even more importantly, it let the mage do mage things. So leaving those mobs up for a little bit longer actually allowed the mage to do more funnel, getting the shredder down lower, and overall making the pull time go quicker. So synergy really does matter here. The Paladin may want to contribute more DPS and have a higher spike at the start, but it's actually leading to both a longer pull overall and actually less overall DPS just because of the increased time that it takes. So what have we learned from all of this? Well, from example 1, we saw that AoE pad wins when all of the mobs have equal HP and there's no priority on any individual target. From example 2, we learned that a lieutenant mob being introduced, something with a lot more HP, all of a sudden makes priority damage pull ahead, and especially funnel damage. And in example 3, we found that while a pad class may come in and have a flashy spike overall, killing the funnel mobs actually makes the mage do significantly less damage to the priority target overall and makes the key or the pull go significantly longer. So here's where it goes a little bit deeper though. If we did example 4, which I haven't actually illustrated, and we had the Paladin be able to swap between different damage profiles mid-pull, what we've learned from these examples is the absolute fastest way would be for a more priority-focused approach when the lieutenant mob is still alive, and then if there are still smallies left at the end, swapping to a pad sort of style would then make that part of the pull go quicker. So when you're building out a DPS comp, both how the individual DPS approach the pull as well as the actual composition itself matters a lot. So for example, if you went all AoE, like 3 DPS that were all doing pad, you would kill the small things extremely quick, but you would have this lieutenant mob left with heaps of HP that would take forever to kill. I'm sure we've all had situations where you finished a pull and there's just one big chunky elite left in the middle with 40% HP and it takes you forever to whittle it down. Now, on the other hand, if you took all funnel classes or all Prio classes, that lieutenant mob may absolutely melt, but you're going to have a bunch of small trash left behind that no one can effectively clean up. So what is the answer? Well, balance, basically. Your ideal DPS trio shouldn't do the same type of damage, basically. You really want one sort of Prio or funnel focused spec to melt those lieutenant mobs. You want one padder that can deal with the low HP trash and clean it up at the end. And then ideally sort of one like hybrid or flexible spec that can lean either way. So what can we do now that we know this? Well, firstly, you can actually monitor the DPS profiles of your own group in real time by just seeing how pulls end up towards the end. If you are doing pulls with your regular group and you're finding that a lieutenant mob is alive at the end, then your group is in need of more priority focused damage. If you're finding that the lieutenant mobs are dying really quick and you've got lots of smallies left up with a bunch of HP, you probably need more pad. The other thing we've learnt is that if you're a class that can choose between 2 damage styles mid-pull, and you have a funnel class like a mage or a rogue in the group, it's actually much better for you to sacrifice some of your own damage to allow the mage to do slightly more. And then even though, it's less fun and you get a bit like a smaller spike, the pull as a whole actually goes faster and your DPS at the end is also higher just because the pull timer was shorter. That's just how the maths works around it. The next thing that we can take from this as well is, and this is something that I've seen a lot in sort of like low, mid, and even high keys, is that you really need to focus on putting your main damage into the highest HP mob. What I see a lot is people cleaving off of, say, like a caster mob that needs kicking. Now, yes, that caster does need kicking. However, putting most of your damage into it is just significantly slowing down the key. So what I've got to help with this is a couple of macros. So the first is a mouse over target, which will then mark the mob with a marker of your own choice, and then a focus kick macro. So what you can do with this is you can cleave off of the primary target, like the shredder tank, and still be monitoring the kick on the caster mob that you need to deal with, basically. This will be a huge time save. It will mean that you don't have to tab target between mobs, which, let's be real, in massive AoE pools is really hard to do as well. And it will also ensure that you're putting the majority of your damage into the mob that needs it the most. To wrap it all up, the fastest groups blend priority and funnel damage with mass AoE. Even if we look at the current quote-unquote meta comp, we've got Arcane Mage blowing up priority mobs. We've got Balanced Druid doing a more paddy sort of damage profile. And then we've got Unholy DK that does mostly pad, but can pivot into more priority focused damage when it's needed. It's about team composition, not just personal performance. If you found this breakdown useful, drop a like and subscribe. There's more Mythic Plus content to come in the future. You got a topic you want me to cover, head to the comments, let me know. I do read them all, small YouTuber things. If you want to catch me live on stream, I'm on Twitch. I'll pop the link somewhere on the screen here. Come hang out and ask questions anytime you want. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed and found this useful. And until next time, gamers, take care.